So I am Vanessa Foncke. I come from Zottegem, which is a small town near Ghent, and I did my law school entirely at the University of Ghent. Why I went to study in the US? Well, actually, I was a bit hesitant at first after finishing law school. It wasn't really my first idea to do an extra year, leave alone in the States. So I went into what I always wanted to do, and I went into law practice, so I became a lawyer. And after having worked for about 3 years, I mean, the feeling of wanting to do something extra, getting back into law school, and then also preferably abroad, I mean, the idea came up again. So I started looking around a bit, and English was actually the most obvious choice, so to do actually an extra education in English. So I started comparing different programs in Great Britain and in the States. But okay, when ending up, and specifically for what I wanted to do, so I wanted to do something in dispute resolution, preferably alternative dispute resolution, so mediation, negotiation techniques, so more the practical kind of education. And that is something that I found better in the States in their programs than, for example, in Great Britain. So that is mainly why I started looking into universities in the United States. So I started comparing different universities. How? I think firstly based on rankings. So okay, because in the end it's still a big financial investment that you have to make. So I wanted to see that I had good value for money, of course. So I started looking into the rankings. I tried to diversify a bit. I mean, different top 10 universities, also one like top 20, like also one spare university that should have accepted me anyway. And that way I applied at, I think, about 4 or 5 universities. And in the end, when I got my acceptance from Columbia University, I actually didn't hesitate, so I was allowed at NYU as well. But the fact that, okay, Columbia University, it's still an Ivy League university. They have a beautiful campus, although everybody that studied at NYU will counter-argue and say that New York is in the center of all that's happening in New York. But actually, I loved living uptown in the end as well. I mean, you can always go downtown, I mean, for doing shopping, for having a drink, for meeting up with your friends, whatever. But I liked in the evenings always going back uptown. It's a little bit nicer, you have a little bit more space, a little bit more air. So I mean, the program was actually quite fantastic for me as well. So I was able to do those things that I really wanted to do. So a more practical angle. I took, for example, a negotiations workshop that allowed me to actually do different negotiations in different settings on different topics. I was also able to enroll in a mediation clinic. So I actually got the training as a mediator in New York, so which allowed me to also go to the community centers, to the Harlem courts. And I mean, that for me was an entirely valuable experience because you really get a look upon American life, how the Americans live in New York. And you actually get to the core of their lives a bit because, I mean, you only see them when they are in dispute with their neighbors, with some of their contracting parties. And I mean, so you actually get a bit into their private lives. You can better see how they work. You get in touch with people that you actually wouldn't meet otherwise. Because that's a bit the other thing, I think, as an LLM, so as an international student, that you have to be a bit aware that you don't get caught into your little circle of international students alone, that you also try to reach out towards the American students, but that you also try to go a little bit further than simply the student group. I mean, and that I think is also where Fulbright comes into play a little bit, because it gave me the opportunity through the New York chapter to meet people from different departments. I mean, who did language studies, cultural studies, whatever. I mean, it's not obvious to get in touch with those either, because you still have to take into account universities like Columbia, like NYU. Those are fairly big universities. So, I mean, in the end, it's normal that you stick together with the people that you know, which is mostly your LLM program, in my case, for example. So and that is, I think, where Fulbright played a more important role for me because it was the ideal opportunity to meet with people who did other studies as well. And then, for example, I was also invited to one of the seminars in Washington. So they have them at different locations in San Diego and in Washington and, well, I forgot the other locations. But then there as well, you actually get the opportunity to also meet students from different universities across the different states. So, and that kind of a mixture, that was a very valuable experience for me as well. I think one major advice that I would give to everyone is try to start as early as possible. I mean, if you have the idea, reach out to people who have done the program, so an international program before, ask them for tips, ask them for advice. It can be very small stuff, but I mean, it can really add up in the end. And definitely start as early as possible. I mean, 1 year in advance is definitely not exaggerated. I mean, for example, a TOEFL, your English language tests, is something that apparently you have to book practically 1 year in advance, which thanks to one of my friends I got to know as well, because I thought I had plenty of time to do so. But I found out that they only organize it once or twice in Brussels, apparently. So if you don't want to go, for example, to Paris or to London to take one, I mean, you have to be fairly early to register. So that was one side. And then, of course, you have the financial side. So it is, as I said before, it's a huge investment to make. I think an investment that is worth a while in the end. But still, you have to be able to assemble all of the funds in advance, especially, and I mean, then there I think your choice of university comes into play as well. I really had the idea, I looked for different universities into New York. I thought it's an exciting city. I really wanted to go to New York. But you also have to realize in advance that an LLM in New York is going to cost you a lot more than, for example, an LLM at Duke or somewhere on the West Coast, where life is a little bit more paced, where it's also a little bit cheaper. So I think, but then I'm going back to choice of university again, things to take into account. But okay, as to financial investments, there again, start in time early, because there are different grants, fellowships. So okay, most important of them is of course the Fulbrights, the BAFs. But apart from that, I found out, but a bit too late, that for example different Rotary societies give some as well, but they all have, according to the chapter, different requirements. And for example, that is why I was too late. Some Rotary assemblies require you to apply 2 years before you actually go. So there again, the question is a bit to talk to people, to ask how they did it, whether they have any tips, and also to start early enough. One other thing that I apply to, for example, is the Foundation Fernand Lazare. They give interest-free loans to students. So I mean, of course, it's a loan, you have to pay it back, but I mean, you can do so at a pace of 10 years, so which make the terms very bearable. So that's another one I apply to. And of course, I mean, if you're able to negotiate something with your current employer, as I said, I worked some years before. So I mean, there's always there a possibility to ask like a contribution from your employer as well. But again, I mean, it's all about talking to people and finding out what is possible and what is not possible. So I think that's the financial side. And then the last step is actually applying to the different universities, which is once again a very burdensome activity. Because, okay, I'm always a bit strict on my deadlines, knowing myself, but there are always things in the end. I recall, for example, my application for Harvard. So I had everything prepared, the 1 million essays, the different forms, and then I came to the final step, paying for my application fee, when I found out that apparently you couldn't do it through the website, so with a Visa or a MasterCard, but that you had to include something like a certified check. And I had to submit it the day after. So I started calling my bank and they were like, no, not possible, it's gonna take you 2-3 days. So I mean, okay, then you have to start calling the university, try to get somebody online. So then we were able to do it via traveler's checks. So I had to find some kind of an organization selling those here in Brussels. I had to go to the South Station to buy them. And simply to say, there are always a lot of additional aspects that you don't necessarily think about in advance. So being too close to the deadline might not always be a good idea as well. And one additional thing there perhaps is, it's also something that I only found out later, but I have the impression that more and more universities are starting to work with like early registration programs. So for example, Columbia had it, but I didn't know it. But it also takes away a bit of the work, because if I would have applied 3 months earlier at Columbia, they would have accepted me, well, I hoped that they would have accepted me 3 months earlier. And for example, I wouldn't have had to do 3 other applications for universities, because I knew the moment I would get my admission from Columbia, that would be the end for me. So that's something that well, you might want to look into as well. Ik zou gewoon zeggen, ik kan het iedereen aanraden. Het is heel veel werk en op sommige punten lijkt het onoverkomelijk. Zeker ook om de fondsen samen te krijgen. Maar als ik er nu op terugkijk, ik zou het zo terug doen.